The forest didn't welcome outsiders. The deeper she drove into the Appalachian backroads, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just the soft hum of the car tires over cracked dirt. Maps showed nothing beyond the ridge, yet the locals whispered of a place that time had erased, a community born from itself, cursed by its own blood. She had come chasing an urban legend, but what she found was something older, darker, a silence too deliberate to be natural. The trees stood too close together, the air too still, and every turn of the road felt like entering a memory that wanted to be forgotten. Rusted mailboxes marked driveways that led nowhere, and the faint outline of old houses sank into the soil like bones too tired to stay above ground. She stopped when she saw the first sign, a child's shoe, small and half-buried, its leather cracked with age. Beyond it, an old cabin leaned against the fog, its windows blacked out from the inside. The place looked untouched for decades, yet a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. In that moment, she knew the stories weren't folklore. Something still lived here, something that had survived long after the world turned its back. And as night began to fall, she realized she wasn't the one discovering them. They had been waiting for her all along. The story begins with a journalist from Chicago, a woman driven by curiosity and an unshakable need to uncover what others fear to mention. Her latest assignment had started as a rumor, whispers of a place in the Appalachian Mountains where generations of families had vanished from public record. There were no census entries, no birth or death certificates, just a name passed around in hushed tones at old diners and rural bars. It was said that an entire community had turned inward, marrying only among themselves until their children no longer resembled the rest of humanity. What fascinated her wasn't just the horror of it, but the silence surrounding it. No government report, no newspaper archive, no trace of the people who once lived there. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. She left the city behind on a grey autumn morning, armed with a camera, a recorder, and the stubbornness of someone who had spent her life chasing stories that others wouldn't touch. As the landscape changed from highways to narrow dirt roads, she began to feel the isolation that would soon become her companion. The forest grew thicker, the houses fewer, and cell service disappeared entirely. Locals she tried to question along the way offered only vague warnings. Some pretended not to know what she was talking about, others simply turned away. One man at a gas station muttered that some places don't want to be found, his voice trembling just enough for her to believe him. Her GPS failed miles before the supposed site of the old town, leaving her to follow half-forgotten directions scribbled on a napkin. The road narrowed into little more than a muddy trail lined with trees that seemed to lean in closer as she drove. Every so often, she would glimpse something in the woods, a fragment of a fence, a rusted bicycle, the skeleton of a barn devoured by vines. It was clear that people had lived here once, and that they had left in a hurry. Yet what struck her most was the absence of any birds, any sound at all beyond the crunch of her tires and the slow creak of the trees. By the time she reached what might have been the town's edge, the sun was setting, staining the horizon in rust and ash. Her headlights caught the shape of a wooden sign lying face down in the weeds, its paint almost entirely worn away. She wiped away the dirt with her sleeve, and though most of the letters were gone, one word still remained, *hollow star. It wasn't on any map she had seen, but the name felt right, as if it belonged to a place meant to be forgotten. The deeper she went into the region, the more she felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against her curiosity. Every time she tried to bring up the lost community, faces would harden, eyes would avert, and voices would drop to a whisper. It wasn't just fear that kept the locals silent, it was reverence, the kind that comes from living too close to something you don't fully understand. In the small towns scattered along the base of the mountains, she stopped at diners, gas stations, and motels, trying to pry loose any detail. Most people claimed ignorance, but their hands betrayed them, tightening around coffee mugs, trembling slightly as they changed the subject. The old man at the hardware store was the first to say anything that felt like truth. He told her that some bloodlines should have ended long ago and that certain families in those woods had gone too far trying to keep their heritage pure. His words carried an unease that lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. She tried to laugh it off, pretending it was just local superstition. But the more she heard, the less it felt like folklore. There were stories of children born without voices, of people with faces too similar to be coincidence, and of strange gatherings in the woods where lanterns glowed through the fog long after midnight. When she pressed for details, she was met with cold stares and the same warning repeated again and again: leave them be. The mountain doesn't forget. It was said with such quiet conviction that even her skeptic's mind hesitated. Still, her determination only deepened. Fear was usually a sign that something worth finding lay beneath it. She checked into a small roadside motel that smelled of mildew and rain, where the woman at the front desk refused to take her credit card, insisting on cash only. As she handed over the key, the woman leaned in and whispered, "You shouldn't be here after dark." Her tone wasn't threatening, just tired, as if she had seen too many people ignore that same warning. That night, as the wind howled through the cracks of her window, she couldn't sleep. The memory of the old man's words looped in her head, the way his eyes had shifted toward the woods when he said *ended long ago*. It wasn't just a warning, it was regret. Something had happened out there, something the entire region had agreed to bury under silence. And in that silence, she began to sense that whatever had been buried was not resting peacefully. By the third day of her search, the journalist had ventured far beyond where most locals said the roads ended. The air grew thicker, the trees taller, and the daylight dimmed faster than it should have. Her car could go no further, so she continued on foot, guided only by the faint suggestion of a trail disappearing into the woods. The ground was soft beneath her boots, littered with fragments of what might once have been fences or porches, now claimed by moss and rot. It was there, at the edge of a shallow creek, that she noticed something half buried in the mud, a dented metal object catching the last of the afternoon light. She knelt down and dug around it with her fingers until it came loose. It was a rusted mailbox, its paint long peeled away, its flag bent downward like a broken arm. On its side, under a layer of grime, faint letters were still visible, a family name, almost erased by time. She brushed the dirt away carefully until she could read it. The name didn't appear on any of her maps, nor in the archives she'd studied before leaving Chicago, but she remembered it from the old man's trembling voice back at the hardware store. It was the same name he had whispered before telling her to go back, the name of a family that had supposedly vanished generations ago. Her pulse quickened as she realized she had found the first physical proof that this forgotten settlement wasn't a myth. She looked around the clearing, suddenly aware of how quiet everything was. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of wind through the leaves. The woods felt like they were holding their breath. The ground nearby was uneven, as if something large had once been buried or burned there. She could see the faint remains of a path leading deeper into the forest, nearly hidden under decades of fallen leaves. Her instincts told her to turn back, but the weight of the mailbox in her hands felt like a clue she couldn't ignore. As the sun began to sink, she propped the mailbox upright, tracing her fingers over the faint outline of the family name one last time. The metal was cold, even in the fading light, and as she pulled her hand away, she noticed the faint smear of fresh mud along the flag, too moist, too new to have been there for years. For a moment she stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. Someone had touched it recently. The family might have vanished from history, but something or someone still knew their name. That night, after finding the mailbox, she set up a small camp near the creek, too far from civilization to risk driving back in the dark. The woods around her seemed to shift with every gust of wind, their shadows moving like something alive. She told herself the unease was exhaustion, that her nerves were simply reacting to the isolation. But when the fire died down to a faint glow, the silence became unnatural, thick, expectant, almost aware. It was then she heard the first sound, a soft metallic clink, faint but deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. It didn't sound like an animal. It was rhythmic, controlled, as though someone were moving something heavy, dragging metal against stone. She held her breath and listened, trying to locate the source, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it began. Minutes passed before the whispers started, too low to make out words, but too human to mistake for the wind. Her heart pounded as she turned off her flashlight, letting the darkness settle over her like a curtain. The only light came from the dying embers of her fire, flickering weakly against the trees. Every instinct screamed for her to pack up and leave, yet curiosity rooted her to the ground. She strained her ears again and caught the faintest echo of movement, leaves shifting under careful footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond her sight. She whispered to herself that it was an animal, but the sound of breathing, soft and raspy, betrayed that lie. She reached for her camera, though her hands trembled too violently to hold it steady. Through the lens, she caught nothing but shadows, vague shapes dissolving into the dark. Then, as quickly as it began, the forest went still again. No whispers, no metallic scraping, not even the creak of branches. The silence returned, heavier than before. She waited for hours, too afraid to sleep, her flashlight resting in her lap like a weapon. When dawn finally arrived, the forest looked deceptively peaceful. Mist curled along the ground, hiding what might have happened in the night. She stepped outside her tent, scanning the clearing. That was when she saw them, faint impressions in the mud, a trail of footprints leading from the trees to just a few feet from where she had slept. They were smaller than hers, almost childlike, and next to them, pressed into the damp earth, lay the faint imprint of a hand. The metal mailbox she had left near the creek now sat upright beside her fire, as if someone had placed it there gently during the night. By morning, the sense of being watched had grown unbearable. The forest seemed to study her every movement, and even the mist carried a weight that pressed against her lungs. She followed the faint trail of footprints leading away from her camp, her boots sinking into the wet ground as she moved deeper between the trees. The air smelled of decay and iron, a scent that thickened as she walked. Soon, the faint outline of a structure emerged through the fog, the crooked frame of a cabin, its roof half collapsed under years of neglect. The sight sent a chill through her spine. It looked abandoned, but there was something too deliberate about its stillness, as though it was pretending to be forgotten. The front door hung loosely on one hinge, and when she pushed it open, the sound echoed through the hollow interior like a warning. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the pale light that leaked through the cracks in the walls. The room smelled of mildew, old wood, and something faintly sour. Her eyes adjusted slowly, revealing fragments of a life left behind, a rusted lantern, a cracked mirror, and a rocking chair that swayed slightly though there was no breeze. Against the far wall, a table sat buried under a film of dust, covered in photographs, hundreds of them, stacked and scattered, curling at the edges with age. She brushed one off and froze. The image showed a group of people standing outside the same cabin decades earlier. Their faces were warped in strange, unsettling ways, eyes too close together, jaws slightly uneven, skin pale as candle wax. At first, she thought the distortion came from the camera, but as she picked up more photos, the truth became clear. Every generation in those pictures looked eerily similar, as if the same faces were being born over and over again. Parents and children were nearly indistinguishable, sharing the same warped features, the same hollow gaze. The more she looked, the colder her hands became. These weren't just portraits, they were a record of something unnatural. In the corner of the room, a small crib stood covered with a torn sheet. She lifted it gently and found a single doll with glass eyes clouded by dust. Its head was cracked, the stuffing spilling from one side, but beneath it lay another photograph, this one newer, clearer. It showed 3 figures standing near the creek, the outline of a tent visible behind them. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her camp. The photo was taken last night. The people in it weren't from her world, and yet they were close enough to touch. Her hands shook as she clutched the photograph, the realization settling like ice in her stomach. Whoever, or whatever, had taken it knew she was there. She turned to leave the cabin, but something in the corner caught her eye, a narrow wooden door, nearly hidden behind a collapsed shelf. It was smaller than a regular door, as if built for someone who never grew full height. Dust coated the handle, but there was a faint smear where it had recently been touched. Against her better judgment, she pulled it open. A waft of cold, stale air drifted out, carrying with it the scent of damp paper and rot. Steps led down into darkness, and at the bottom, a faint glimmer of light flickered from what looked like a lantern still burning after decades. She descended cautiously, the wooden stairs groaning under her weight. The small room below was lined with shelves filled with glass jars, some containing preserved specimens that had long since turned murky with age. In the center stood an old desk covered in handwritten notes, sketches of human anatomy, and medical records stained with brownish rings. A cracked nameplate read Dr. Elias Baron *, the same surname she had seen on the mailbox by the creek. Her pulse quickened as she leafed through the papers, realizing they belonged to the town's only doctor. His handwriting grew more erratic with each page, the tone shifting from clinical observation to something closer to obsession. He wrote of a project to preserve the purity of the bloodline, convinced that their isolation was sacred. The early entries spoke of pride, of a community dedicated to staying untouched by outsiders. But the later ones turned desperate, filled with accounts of deformities, mental decay, and births that defied explanation. He documented the children born without voices, others with mirrored features, and some that never lived past their first breath. The doctor had tried to correct them, his words, not hers, through crude experiments meant to reverse generations of inbreeding. Jars on the shelves contained the remnants of his failures. It became clear that what had begun as a misguided belief in purity had devolved into madness. The final entries no longer mentioned medicine at all. They spoke of whispers beneath the floorboards and faces in the walls, as though he had begun to see his patients or his creations everywhere. The last line was almost unreadable, smeared in ink and something darker. Asterisk, they won't let me leave. The blood remembers. Asterisk. She stared at the words until her flashlight began to flicker. Then, from somewhere beyond the basement walls, came a faint tapping sound, steady, deliberate, and close enough to make her realize she was no longer alone down there. By the time she climbed out of the cellar, dusk had already settled over the woods, turning the light into a dull orange haze that bled through the cracks of the broken walls. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one trembling as if the forest itself had learned to breathe beside her. The doctor's journal was still in her hand, the pages damp from the humidity of the cellar, but her focus kept drifting toward the sound she had heard before leaving, the slow, rhythmic tapping that hadn't come from her imagination. She stepped outside, the air colder now, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. The trees stood motionless, the silence absolute except for the occasional snap of a distant branch. She forced herself to believe it was an animal, but she knew deep down it wasn't. Something in those woods was aware of her presence. The trail back to her camp felt different, as if the path itself had shifted. Every few steps she turned to check behind her, convinced she saw movement between the trees. Once, she caught a flicker of pale skin or fabric, vanishing the moment she raised her light. By the time she reached the clearing, the fire had long burned out, and the remnants of her tent sagged as though something heavy had brushed against it. Her recorder lay on the ground, still running, the small red light blinking faintly. She picked it up and replayed the last few minutes of audio. The first sound was her own voice from earlier in the day, but then came the faint rustle of leaves, followed by breathing, slow, ragged, and close. Then a whisper, low and strained, almost human. Asterisk, why did you come back? Asterisk. Her stomach clenched as she scanned the woods, her flashlight sweeping across the trees. That was when she saw them, footprints, circling her camp. They weren't from boots or sneakers but bare feet, small and uneven, the kind left by someone who had spent a lifetime walking without shoes. She followed them to the edge of the clearing where they disappeared into the mud, replaced by drag marks leading deeper into the forest. As she crouched to examine them, a twig snapped behind her. She turned sharply, catching a fleeting glimpse of movement between the trunks, something hunched and quick, retreating into the shadows. Her heart pounded, but fear mixed with something worse, the unmistakable sensation of being studied. Each time she blinked, she thought she saw faces among the trees, pale and motionless, watching her from the dark. The night was no longer silent. The forest was breathing again, and this time, it was breathing with her. The following morning brought no comfort. The forest looked unchanged, but the air carried a new stillness, the kind that follows a warning unheeded. She packed her equipment quickly, determined to leave, but the trail back toward her car was gone. The trees had closed in during the night, their roots twisting over what had been a clear path. Every direction looked the same, each turn leading her deeper instead of out. Hours passed, her compass spinning uselessly, until she stumbled upon a narrow clearing she hadn't seen before. At its center sat a woman wrapped in layers of faded shawls, her face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. She was sitting on an old tree stump, motionless, as though she had been waiting. The journalist hesitated, unsure if the woman was real or another illusion born of exhaustion. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and brittle, like something dry cracking in the wind. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. The words felt rehearsed, as if she had said them countless times before. The journalist approached slowly, explaining that she was looking for the town that had disappeared, the one that used to be called Hollow. The woman let out a faint, humorless laugh. "It didn't disappear," she said. "It just went quiet." She lifted her head slightly, revealing eyes so pale they almost reflected the light. Her skin was grayish, translucent in places, and her lips trembled as she spoke again. "I'm the last of them. The blood won't die, even when it should." The journalist's heart pounded as she asked what had happened to the others. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a rusted pendant, the same family name engraved on it as the one she had found on the mailbox. "They thought purity was salvation," she said. "But the blood turned against us. It wanted something else, something older." Her gaze drifted toward the trees, and her voice softened to a whisper. "They never died. The earth took them, but it didn't keep them." The forest around them seemed to grow darker as she spoke, the light dimming as though the trees themselves were listening. The journalist asked if she meant that people still lived out there, hidden somewhere in the woods. The woman smiled faintly, her teeth small and uneven. "Lived," she murmured. "No. They learned to hide." Her hand reached out and touched the journalist's arm, cold as stone. "And now that you've seen them, they'll come for you too. The blood doesn't forget." The forest began to close in the moment the old woman disappeared. 1 second she was there, sitting on the stump, her pale eyes staring into the trees. The next, a gust of wind swept through the clearing and the space she had occupied was empty. The air felt wrong, heavier, as though something had shifted beneath the ground. The journalist stood frozen, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, until she finally forced herself to move. She walked in circles, searching for the trail again, but every turn led her deeper into the woods. Her flashlight flickered in the growing dusk, revealing fragments of structures she hadn't noticed before, pieces of fences, door frames, the outline of foundations swallowed by moss and earth. The lost town wasn't gone, it had simply sunk into the forest, buried under layers of time and silence. Then she saw the first entrance. It was nothing more than a gap in the earth, half covered by rotting boards and dead leaves, but when she knelt to look closer, a cold draft brushed her face. She could smell damp soil and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. A narrow tunnel stretched into the darkness, reinforced with wooden beams that looked far too new to have been built decades ago. Her instincts screamed to stay out, but the journalist in her refused to leave without proof. She switched on her camera light and descended slowly, her boots sinking into the wet ground. The tunnel twisted and branched like a maze, the walls lined with strange carvings, crude symbols, spirals, and names etched over one another in desperate layers. The deeper she went, the more signs she found that someone, or something, had been living there recently. There were scattered pieces of fabric, empty jars, bones that didn't look entirely animal. She found another tunnel leading upward and followed it until she reached a chamber that opened beneath a collapsed house. Above her, through gaps in the floorboards, she could see faint streaks of light from the surface. Then came the noise. Soft, rhythmic breathing echoed from the far end of the tunnel. She turned her light toward it, revealing more photographs pinned to the wall, images of herself walking through the woods, setting up her camp, sleeping by the fire. Each photo was marked with a crude symbol drawn in something dark. Her throat tightened as the breathing grew louder, closer. When she turned back toward the exit, the path she had taken was gone. Only the sound of footsteps remained, slow and wet, moving through the dirt behind her as if the earth itself had begun to follow. The air inside the tunnels felt alive, pulsing with a damp rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She moved blindly, the camera light trembling in her shaking hands, casting long shadows that twisted across the earthen walls. Every sound felt amplified, her own breathing, the crunch of dirt beneath her boots, the faint dripping of unseen water. The deeper she went, the stronger the stench became, a sickly mix of decay, mold, and something coppery that burned her throat. She tried to retrace her steps, but the tunnels seemed to shift each time she turned, like the earth was rearranging itself to keep her from leaving. Somewhere behind her, she could still hear the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, never hurried, always at the same distance, no matter how fast she moved. Her flashlight began to fade, the beam shrinking to a narrow cone of light. That was when she noticed the marks on the walls changing, no longer names or symbols, but handprints. Hundreds of them, pressed deep into the dirt, layered over one another in all sizes. Some were small, like a child's, others long and skeletal. She touched one without thinking and flinched. It was warm. The walls pulsed faintly beneath her fingers, as though they were breathing. She stumbled back, her heel catching on something buried. When she looked down, she realized it was a bone human, smooth from age but freshly broken at one end. Her chest tightened as she scanned the ground, seeing more bones half buried in the mud, arranged in spirals that seemed intentional. The air grew heavier with each step, until she entered a wider chamber lit by faint shafts of light seeping through cracks above. The space was filled with remnants of furniture, photographs, and scraps of clothing, the remnants of the town she had been searching for. It wasn't abandoned, it had been swallowed. And then she saw them. At first, they looked like shapes carved into the far wall, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized they were faces, pale, glistening, half-merged with the dirt, as if the earth had begun to consume them mid-breath. Their eyes were open, watching her, and when the light hit them, some of their mouths moved soundlessly, expelling thin clouds of dust. The footsteps stopped behind her. Slowly, she turned, and in the faint glow she saw figures emerging from the tunnel, twisted silhouettes with familiar, distorted features that mirrored the faces in the photographs. They were not ghosts, not quite human either. They were what was left when generations refused to let go of their own blood. The ground quivered beneath her feet, and as the faces on the walls began to whisper, she finally understood that Hollow was never deserted. It had simply gone underground, waiting for someone to remember it.